We're going to try and go through photography, film, and art in 40 years plus in 1 hour. So forgive me if I go rapidly like that. But to give you some idea of the change and occurrence that happened at this period of time at the end of the 20th century. To begin with, a lot of the themes you see in this work, a lot of the ideas you see in this work have already been expressed in the earlier part of the century. You have people playing with political ideas, you have people playing with different styles of creation, you have certainly technology affecting the look and shape of the way imagery works. All these things have occurred before. What you're going to see is that some of these ideas converge, and within that convergence there are a great number of variations. And that's the sort of significance of the last part of the 20th century, is the fact that go on and create significant works of art and significant and striking photographs, but they have reference to the past. So your eye on the future as an artist is always dictated by what has come before. There are basically two images that I use to frame these last 4 decades. We're on about the 50th anniversary of this one, of course, and anybody who's been watching any television knows that this is the 50th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination in Dallas. This, of course, being a frame from one of the most famous motion picture strips of all time, done by a man named Abraham Zapruder, who filmed the actual assassination, unbeknownst to him at the time, of course, in a piece of memorable 200 some odd frames of film. This being one section of it. The other image which occurs in 2001. This one does not have a print light per se. This appeared as a digital image. It appeared 2 days after the horrors of 9/11 in 2001. Supposedly, according to the story on the website, from a camera found on the scene of the destruction at the World Trade Center, depicting a tourist atop the Trade Center at the actual moment that a plane was about to hit. When this occurred, I had all sorts of people phoning us from the media and from fellow curators and saying, do you believe this is true or not? We debated about it for quite a while, but for a number of reasons, it always looked highly suspicious to me, and it turned out to be a fake. But it also turned out to be indicative of that particular style of work that was capable of being created at the time, and I think sends out a huge warning about it. There are all sorts of things wrong with this image. The plane is coming from the wrong direction, the sky is not as you see it. It seems to be striking the other building. It's much too high for where the image struck the building. The plane struck the building. There's all sorts of things wrong with it. People reacted in different ways, especially on the web. They began to satirize the tourist. They put him at the destruction or at the sinking King Kong's attack. My favorite, the attack of the State Park. Some way to answer this in some sort of way. But we were faced with the fact that the camera lied, and in the process of lying, we were confronted with that change of aspect of truth and ideals. Those sort of ways that the camera, at least at the start of the 19th century, you had the faith in the truth of the photographic image. By the end of it, you don't. We stopped, I guess, last time with Robert Frank and his decidedly different look at America in the 60s. And from that era, a few shows emerged which were very significant and important. Two of them both embraced the sort of idea of a social landscape. That appeared in the mid-60s. The idea that before us was not just a physical landscape, but also one of society and culture that were before us. And 2 shows at Brandeis and Eastman House largely pointed this up. They were pretty much indifferent to any sort of political or social reform at the time. They wanted to show valid picture making, not from a socio-psychological point of view, but rather from a sense of showing what's there. The phrase that most came out of this was one of the photographers, Gary Winogrand, said, "I photograph to find out what the world looks like photographed," which has all sorts of irony to it as well. The three photographers most featured at that time, Arvis, Friedlander, and Winogrand, came through with the New Documents show. Their work was different. It dared to show the ugly, or it dared to show the different, or it dared to show the non-normal in life. Arbus by direct confrontation, Friedlander by landscapes and cityscapes which didn't have any sort of beauty to them per se, at least not initially. And Winogrand by trying to take a different point of view. Often his camera was tilted, or people were tilted within the frame in juxtapositions like that. Gary, by the way, taught here at UT in the 70s. This is the way he saw a UT football game in one of his more famous pictures. These new documents, if you will, and it's interesting to see that use of the word documents, were trying to show that there were different ways of seeing the world that was there. Another thing that affected photography at this time was the influence from art. The fact that artists were recognized in different ways now, that they grew out of that abstract expressionism of Pollock into pop art, into photorealistic painting, and finally into mixed media. That's pretty significant because although photographs had always been tampered with in some way or transferred in some way, now we had artists actually intentionally incorporating photographs into paintings, into printmaking, even into sculpture in some instances, in any way in design in order to make a different impact with a different look. So that you had a number of photographers grew from this era and through this era of work. You've seen Jackson Pollock, of course, in the abstract expressionist work that grew out of that. The men who were called actual neo-Dadaists, if you will, were the ones who were primarily interested in seeing how paint could affect the relationship of the painter or the printmaker with the photograph. So you had people like Jasper Johns and people like Robert Rauschenberg, who took images from magazines and images from photographs and drawings and their own etchings and print workings and putting them all together in different collage manners. You had reference, of course, to Rene Magritte. He's actually earlier in the century, but his popularity especially came to the fore in the 60s and the 70s. Those mysterious sort of romanticized, realistic sort of seeming paintings that were there. All that, of course, blended into pop art at that time, where you had people like Lichtenstein paying attention to the cartoon world, and you had people like Andy Warhol zooming into popular culture in different ways and making it work. He actually did use the Polaroid camera to take Polaroid photographs, but he also used the source of that imagery to perpetuate it in other works, such as making photogravures and other etchings from the actual photographs too, so that he was playing with the different media simultaneously. You had people like Richard Estes, the photorealists. This isn't a photograph, this is a painting. He would attempt to try and show the world as it looked real in every detail. You had to have a lot of patience to do this too, of course, but the attempt was to at least try and make your paintings look like a photograph instead of your photographs look or be modeled after paintings. That's taken up in the later parts of the century by people like David Hockney, who did joiners. If you look at this closely, each one of these little sections, if you will, is simply a commercially printed snapshot. He would take a snapshot camera, photograph, and grid out the whole scene, get them commercially processed, then glue them together, what he called joiners. You can probably see it a bit better in something like this, too, where the world becomes, well, what? I mean, Picasso would have loved this, undoubtedly. But that sort of thing was going on. You had conceptual artists, things like Ed Ruscha, whose archive just came to HRC last week, by the way. Yay. Okay. Who did the commonplace in the everyday and did them in very much small publications, like 26 gas stations that he stopped at en route across the country, that he would then publish in small books. This is Ruscha with all his little small books all over him to show the work as well. Or you had, at the end of the century, people like Ai Weiwei, who incorporated not so much the actual creation of any physical piece as it was the documentation of the artist doing something to transform nature, in this case, dropping a vase. This is a museum piece consisting of 3 big photographs of him himself, self-portrait-wise, breaking a vase. And finally, other people like Damien Hirst and others who would use realism as the touch point from which to create installations of sculpture and other works. At the same time, our friend John Sorkowski again, you remember him from our first lecture about the photographer's eye when he tried to break down the 5 independent characteristics of a photograph, coming and saying that this was a need to abandon this allegiance to traditional pictorial standards, that we no longer should make photographs just for the pictureness of it, but rather to invent terms that were working, what he called photography born whole. The goal was to make the photograph, as he called it, seamlessly persuasive, not factually impeccable. Get us away just from the documentary aspects of it to try and make it in some manner more influential in the daily life of people experiencing the photograph. So that something as simple as Aaron Siskin's photograph of paint peeling can become sculptural, can become dramatic, can become tactile. Or the complexity of an image by Ralph Gibson. This has no caption, it has no explanation, it has no rules to follow about how I did this picture. Or people, again, like Jerry Uelsman, who actually photo manipulated images, did collages and cut them out, but still sort of set them in the real world, but not really. Well, at this time, photography became institutionalized. MoMA, of course, set up its Department of Photography in 37. The Eastman House came along in 47. And finally, the Society for Photographic Education was formed in 1963. If you taught photography in a college before 1963, you were largely teaching a trade, not an art form, not a means of communication. It wasn't until really the 70s and 80s that undergraduate and graduate programs came along in art departments. And in art, there they recognized photography as a form of artistic expression and established that work. The other thing that added validity to that was, of course, in the 1970s, there was an art market formed. No longer could you buy an Edward Weston print for $25. It now was worth several $1,000s because collectors entered the field and increased the rarity and importance of building these collections. Also, photography and mass media began to have an important impact too. Artists and viewers tend to experience it as one medium, and you had a belief in that educational power of the medium. What McLuhan said about the medium being the message. So that with this convergence now, there are many approaches to the arts, and that electronic communication is shrinking the world at the same time. Photojournalism is becoming much more immediate. Pictures can be taken and published within the same hour. McLuhan's enthusiasm for that media and the postmodernist desire to see that fusion of mass culture was all coming together in a very rapid way. So photographers remained divided at the end. We had photojournalists, we had artists, but we had this whole blending of the two together. And it now reflects both that glamour and the attractive, ominous nature of globalization. We were seeing artists emerge in other countries in a great form in the international scope by the 1970s and 1980s. It was beginning to be established around the world in a very active fashion. The last thing to note about this whole era is technology. The rise of automation, not only in terms of how we communicate, but in terms of how we create art. The prevalence of color, of course, should again be noted because it has never died out, it has only increased. But the digital world especially is that revolution that we'll talk about in a minute, where things were easy to make. Yes, you could make records. Yes, you could manipulate. Yes, you could fabricate. Yes, you could expedite, and also you could lie. The first digital cameras weren't that easy to handle. They were a little clumsy and a little hard, but they gave you immediate imagery. And with that, you began to construct, first in the dark rooms, but later in what we call light rooms, actual digital images. So that the 1984 edition of Science magazine included a picture of a pool game, none of the elements of which were real. They were all constructed by digital means. It was used in various social applications. You're probably all familiar with the fact that Time was indicted for taking the mugshot of isn't that wonderful when you get old enough that you forget the name of the person? OJ, yes. This happens more and more. Enjoy your youth. Okay, anyway, let's do it. And in manipulating it so they look more sinister on their cover than he actually was in the other picture. Digital artists continue to work in different ways and different patterns. They would create whole worlds and whole environments at this time. Until we have the modern day, where we have the cell phone now, where it's now potentially easy to take it out and do it, and just take the pictures there. This, by the way, is a tagging party in New York. Those traditional dimensions still exist, but they have fascinating variations with them that go on at this time. Richard Avedon, who was famous for those commercial portraits and advertisements and portraiture in the late 60s and 70s, by the end of the era was photographing his father through different stages dying of cancer. All right, speaking of dying, Benetton actually incorporated AIDS in its campaigns for its product. Landscapes became more minimalistic so that Robert Adams could photograph not the mountains of the West, but the movie theater up there. Or Richard Mizrak could go and photograph a Western landscape not made up of rivers and streams, but of a bombing range. Those sort of things, can you find beauty in it? Even somebody like Carl Fiorenza, who created entire landscapes in the studio. This is cloth and fiber and metal and crumpled aluminum made to look like a landscape. Politics, always there, and began to be reflected more and more in terms of the political, the moral, the sexual, the cultural, that artists were there. Yes, they are more liberal-minded as a general rule, and therefore they do attack these questions more with their imagery. There were ongoing conflicts that appeared at the time because it became an emotional and cultural battleground. Nick Dixon photographed his wife together with his grandmother. Is that a statement of female independence or just a moment in the day? Sally Mann photographed her two young daughters in provocative settings. Laura Lee hid a camera on herself and would go on blind dates and photograph her blind dates. You find this work in the different lakes as you go. You will find different sort of cultural aspects of what's there. Perhaps the most famous one from the 80s was Andre Serrano's Piss Christ. An exhibition that had this image in it, and I rapidly say not the artist himself, but an exhibition done by the Cleveland Museum, was funded with government money. A picture of a statue of Christ in a jar of urine. If you know Serrano's always been fascinated with bodily fluids. But he made this creature and put a title on it and got into all sorts of trouble, including a Senate investigation and punishment for the National Endowment for the Arts because of it. Politics remains also a critical subject of photography. This is Nancy Berson's famous collage from the 80s called Warhead, which is a combination of the Soviet leader and Ronald Reagan. It's not new. Political propaganda's been there. You remember the Soviet propaganda from the 50s and the 60s. The McCarthy hearings in the 50s also, where he actually used a photograph that he cropped in order to try and create a false case against someone, and got blasted in the press. Che Guevara and Corda's famous photograph. This is the full frame of Che. This is the way it's been cropped and used as the most popular selling photograph of the latter half of the 20th century. It's interesting that when Che was killed, leading revolutions in Colombia, the way he was identified was by showing a magazine photograph of him next to the corpse. But the image that everyone has and pertains to this one is, of course, the one that has been treated in the social realist style of the Soviets with posters of all sorts and shapes. That posterization of art is something that's continued throughout the century. The Vietnamese used it for their own particular campaign in Vietnam. And we saw it again surface again, of course, in Barack Obama's campaign, too. Interestingly enough, this form of social realism also made its way into the journals of the time when he was elected, and also became a very famous court case, too, because the artist who created the poster took the image from a photograph done by an AP photographer and didn't bother to either credit or pay the AP photographer. And so it became an entire court case also, in which he was found guilty. By the way, there's an app on your phone. You can make these for yourself now, too, as well. This is the one I'm using for my dog catcher campaign next year, too. Anyway, but you can do it. It's that handy. At any rate, beyond the political is the conceptual, where theory would inspire illustration, where you had political and cultural considerations. The triumph of the idea over the image, as one wag put it. Again, we have Rouché's 26 gas stations, Bart Parker's very fascinating color work, where he would actually take and narrate what the subject was about by text at the bottom of the image. The Starnes brothers, who had taken collage work much in the way that they did in the 19th and early 20th century, but the difference was they would collage with things like airplane glue, roofing tar, things like that, to give it a three-dimensional quality. Robert Heineken, who would make three-dimensional jigsaws out of nude fragments, or do pictures of commentators to give a social commentary about the television world. Tom Barrow, who would take an ordinary photograph on a glass plate, scratch the glass plate to cancel it, and then print that up. Robert Cumming, who would do these sort of satirical looks. In this case, this is his scientific experiment of rolling balls off the tin roof of his garage. John Fall. This one is called Bermuda Triangle. Vic Muniz, who would take an ordinary piece of white paper, stretch it out on the floor, and then, in this case, get about 10,000 kids' toys and shape them around it so that he created a Raphael angel in the blank space left by the images. He also does this with everything from food stuff to plastic wrap. The fictional lie occurs as well. The fact that we can tell some of the story or some of the sense about it, this sort of evolved from cinema as well, but the rise of videography made it possible too. The camera became narrative, it became metaphorical. It had nothing to do with the subject matter of the photograph, but because it was coupled with words or with thought or with fictional expression, it did. Cindy Sherman's perhaps most famous for this. She did an entire series of pictures of herself in various poses, costumes, and places in the model of motion picture stills. And the Museum of Modern Art has just bought the whole set, by the way. It's like Sandy Scoglin's work, too, where she would actually design sets that in some ways were metaphorical and pose actual people in them, and then make these big prints. This is Radioactive Cats. It's a favorite of your other teacher, by the way. Or The Revenge of the Goldfish. Interesting thing is when you walk by one of these big prints in the gallery, it makes you stop. Or Dwayne Michaels, who would simply get his models to pose and then create entire fictions with the narrative about them. This photograph is my proof. There was that afternoon when things were still good between us, and she embraced me and we were happy that it happened. She did love me. Look, see for yourself. This photograph is the proof. Of course, it's entirely a work of fiction. There's historical resonance that goes on too. The fact that we use historical imagery either as a source for other rephotographic work or adapt it in some way with other historical processes. Some of it's just straightforward. Bernice Abbott took this scene in New York in 1937. Douglas Levine came through and shot it again in 2002. Same place, same camera size. How this time changes. Another photographer actually took an old photograph of her mother and father cutting a wedding cake in their house, did a modern color photograph in her house, and overprinted the old scene on the new space, so that it became almost a ghost-like memory of that spot. Anna Palunku Matthew, who is pictured here on the left, from India, went back to the Native American work of Curtis and photographed satirical pictures of herself. So you have circa 1906, Red Indian, circa 1996, Brown Indian. Would do this in the sequence with different works too. And this is a tintype by Jane Hines Bideau. She went to the actual prisons of Louisiana, brought costumes with her, dressed the inmates up in dress costumes, and by the way, they enjoyed doing this. They had fun with dress-up days in prison, and then would photograph them in these ways. Rita DeWitt, who actually did color Xerox on cloth and then made a quilt out of it. This is a family quilt, about 8 by 12 feet. Or others who simply used pinhole photography, the old lensless photography system, or even would take a sheet of film, pour chemicals on it to make designs that they liked, and do a print from that chemical design, so that no camera was involved in this sort of collage work. The cinematic influences on photography, also prevalent, of course, from the newsreels that happens every day. But we would do such work as Ray Metzger's sequential images from street photographs that he made to look like film strips. Allison Smith's photographs of her neighbors that were set up images. Robert Wolf's scenes of the city. At first, nothing more than an ordinary plain scene until you go and focus in on something dramatic or that is happening. That's posed again, but the picture is, do you see it when you see it in the full art? Or is it more important for you to look and look again and consider what might be there? Cinema from this period, oh boy, everything in the world. The scale was from the epic to the human. Political films certainly increased. Social commentary, liberal themes, sexual themes all increased. There was a reflection of the anxiety and the change that occurred starting in the 60s. Of course, the rise of the blockbuster, special effects and digital technologies by the end of that era, film and cultural manifestation. Most successfully, perhaps, were the films that still retained that human element despite all those other facts. So in the cinema from the 60s and the 80s, you had such things as Lawrence of Arabia, which was a dramatic epic. Probably the only film I can think of where if you see it on television, you're really robbing yourself. You've got to see this full image in its whole glory on the screen. Dr. Strangelove, which used political satire and absurdity to talk about the Cold War. Blow Up, which is really in here for Dan, because I can't stand it. But anyway, but it tells you about the 60s and what you missed. About a fashion photographer who has to deal with the reality of a murder and what he can or can't do in order to bring about some resolution. Not giving away the secret to know in the end he gives up, but that's okay. The Graduate, which came out in the late 60s and really reflected, I think, the sort of ambivalence that people who were graduating at that time were having. This thing came out the summer I graduated, just telling you my age, but also tell you the fact that I had 3 or 4 people in my class who were so affected by this film that they proceeded to drop out of their internships appointments in graduate school and went out and explored the world for a year. It had that sort of profound effect, and when a film has that sort of cultural effect, you have to ask yourself why. What is it about such a film that makes at work, because it did. I saw it happen. Taxi Driver from the 70s, Martin Scorsese's picture, which begins as a character study and ends up with you rooting for the bad guy. Annie Hall, which is about another outlier of society, in this case in comic terms. Of course, Woody Allen trying to come to terms with his fringe area on culture. And Star Wars, of course, yes, the grand and glorious epic. It really is significant, I think, to consider this film because George Lucas produced and directed it and made a very significant impact in trying to tap into culture and what it was. And he did it with some of the earliest technological work, too. In many respects, he's really... Sorry. Well, I won't talk about his brilliance anymore. But anyway. And in 1980, The Return of the Secaucus 7, John Sayles' little movie about 60s radicals who were arrested and then get together and basically talk about it for most of the movie. It's really an important film because it was really one of the first independent films, and independent filmmaking really arose in a dramatic fashion in the 90s. So this is sort of the pioneer for that particular image. In the 80s and the 90s, such things as Local Hero, which is a quite gentle film, but it starts out with a study of a man sent from Houston, Texas by an oil company to figure out where they're going to build an industrial site on a beautiful coastline of Scotland. And he runs into all sorts of problems, not the least of which is that he doesn't want to do it. The townspeople basically are willing to sell out. The head of the boss of his company is becoming fascinated with third world sort of things, and also his best assistant is falling in love with a mermaid. So all these things are going on at the time. It's really quite a gentle and strong film. I do recommend it. Come and See, which is probably one of the most brutal anti-war films or anything from Russia. Just grim, dramatic story of a youth who ends up being sucked into World War II fighting for Russia. Cinema Paradiso, which is quite the opposite. Nothing so much as a celebration of film, in this case a movie theater in a small town in Italy, and a young boy who grows up with the projectionist, following the birth and death of that little cinema and the subsequent effect it has on the town people. Do the Right Thing, which is probably one of the most culturally significant and valid pictures of the 80s. Set in Black Bedford Stuyvesant, the contrast between different races mixed into one place. Spike Lee, perhaps more than most, has a good pulse on the whole cultural difference. And it really is quite a dramatic picture to see all these people getting together who can't communicate with one another. Jurassic Park, probably because of its special effects, if nothing else. It was a pioneering film in the digital realm with the increased digital face of what's there. And its digital work was sophisticated beyond word. Groundhog Day, I told you some films are so simple that they're quite eloquent, this being one of them. Satirical, humorous, of course, but also with an important message that you do control your life and can do something to change it. 1999 closed out with two very dramatic and very different films. The Sixth Sense, which had a surprise ending, of course, but also was a quite quiet, almost intimate study of what became a terrifying movie. And the other was Fight Club, David Fincher's book, which again had a twist to it as well. I won't tell you, but essentially was about roles we play in culture and how we choose to live them or not in our lives. Also very dramatic in the fact that at the very end of it, of course, hero and heroine join hands and watch as city skyscrapers are blown up in the revolution. This is 1991, 2 years before 9/11. Very provocative in that respect, too. Well, okay. I think you've got some sense of how cinema evolved in that time. It's reflected as well in the other movements that you saw too. But there's always lying underneath this some sort of pursuit of truth. And that truth is very important to know because photographs are everywhere. They capture moments of newsworthiness. They document scenes in cultures that we don't know. They cover tragedy in the human condition. They show us pictures which have one intent and then have another entirely. These are Cambodian prisoners during the days of Pol Pot in the Cambodian Revolution. All these people were documented before they were killed, and their photographs still exist, even if their graves no longer do. To the domestic and the ordinary, scenes of everyday life that you see. The pictures that we bring back from family, both intimate, momentous, and also as everyday as a Tupperware party. All these things can have an impact with it. The camera still has that power. Gene Smith in the 1980s did a whole photo documentary story on the poisoning of a little village called Minamata in Japan. He covered the press, making the bosses sweat while they tried to preach with the press, and also showed the victims that came out of it. Through that whole documentary story, he told the picture, good and bad, evil and kind, in a series of pictures, and at the same time came back with one monumental photograph, which is so powerful today that it still controls us and makes us weep even at the thought of it. So you have news pictures which appeared in the 70s, the assassination of a Viet Cong by Eddie Adams, all the way down to the 1990s. This is a widow of a Navy Marine having a bedside vigil at his coffin, looking through their family album in the computer. The point is that whole combination of things are coming together in different ways. Nancy Burson, you saw her earlier with the warhead picture of Reagan and Gromyko. You see now in this picture, which you tried to at least combine all the different percentages of racial identity on the planet and put them together in one photograph. This was done not digitally but photochemically in the 1960s with multiple printing overlapping. Time magazine did the same thing digitally at the end of the era, when all multiculturalism was coming to the fore in the 1990s. Which leads me to the last topic, which is photography. The photographer stages scenes. Whether authentic or spontaneous, he arranges them and sets them up. And then the photographer and the gatekeeper digitally manipulate those images. It's done more and more every day, both in dramatic and in subtle ways. And the whole question is what is intent and what is content. You've seen it done historically. We've shown you Lenin and how he would take a couple of members who he no longer needed and drop them out of the picture. You saw it as Stalin gradually reduced the people he was governing with. You even see it in the case of Benito Mussolini, who had the guy holding his horse banished from the final print that he used to publicize himself. Manipulation's not new. This is a Kodak book called Here's How, done in the 1950s, telling you how you can manipulate images. In the 1990s, we had our own name for it, and it got its own magazine. 5 techniques to add a celebrity's head to a nude model's body. Okay, anyway, you can tend to catch of that. But it's done politically, it's done as a tool all the time, too. The Republicans, when Kerry was running for president, showed him at a rally with Jane Fonda. Of course, to help that along, they took it from 2 separate pictures and put it together digitally. It's okay, it's not just a Republican tactic. The Democrats did it with Sarah Palin, too. It's been done in commercially and entertainment all the time. Picture story on TV Guide of Oprah Winfrey borrowed Anne Margaret's body to put on her. Digital work is done this way. Before, instructions, after. And you can see those dramatically in things like, well, a picture of Britney Spears in the final version for the cover of Marie Claire. And not to be sexist, it's also done The actors too. George Clooney loses 10 years. But the news media is where it's most prevalent. It's where it comes about. So you see the shelling of Lebanon done in the 1980s. This is the actual photograph done by the photographer. When Reuters got hold of it, they added some more clouds to it, some more texture to it, made it a bit more dramatic, so much so that when they found out, they killed the picture. Of course, the picture site that found this was a little organization called Little Green Footballs, so in honor of it, Little Green Footballs put themselves in it. And from there, it went through the same tactics. He's everywhere. But seriously, this goes on too. So you see a news story in U.S. News from the 80s of a particular, in this case, mercenary. They so liked this picture that in a later picture, in another edition of the magazine, in order to beef up the photograph, they put him back in it too. A typical and very, very abrupt, I think, cartoon that tells it all. Can we fix it in Photoshop? One of the great lines from all photography now. You see it too when you bother to examine the context of a picture. This nice rebellious portrait of an independent demonstration. When you see the whole sequence and you start backing away from it, you see such things as the context in which the image is made. You see that it's the Third World Youth Against War group protesting in the middle of some sort of street demonstration, in this case in Berkeley, California, until you notice that the lady who's conducting the group, who's leading the group, is wearing a Viet Cong t-shirt. How does that shape what you felt about the first image versus the sixth image? Always look at all the images that are there. Same thing with Ahmadinejad's photograph of the Iranian missile launch. This is the way it actually occurred. This is the way he enhanced it somewhat, give it a fourth missile, make it look more dramatic. If you look at it, you can even pick out where the cloud details and the smoke details are the same, that they've been lifted from one section and put into another digitally. Of course, the internet had an answer for that one too. The point is, the Photoshop tool palette for the creative freelancer has many things that can be used. And we have to constantly question that. We have to constantly be on guard for it, because it's so simple now. What Errol Morris once called the weapon of mass distortion, the camera. So we have the digital era. The tools for that manipulation are readily available. The means of distribution is there. The authenticity is much harder to verify. The final results can look even more real and more natural. And now, baseline. The present generation, your generation, has had these tools from the beginning. My generation didn't. We had, if you made it manipulated with a print, you could pretty well figure out what it was and look at it. But now, it's very easy to do. You see it in everyday work. This is Margaret Burke White's photograph from the Depression. We can now hand colorize pieces. We can put and add spice to the wedding party pictures that we have now too. There's a Barney theme in this I gotta get rid of. So, and especially the cell phone. These are the early flip tops, of course. But you have to remember that what you've got with you is not only a camera, not only a phone, it's a means of communication. You can now put the image together with this means of communication and text a picture anywhere. And as the tools have gotten more sophisticated, we've gotten more formats for this work, it's more prevalent out there. Now pretty much anybody can do this. I'm also fascinated with the fact that, you know, we used to be a nuclear family, now we're a cellular family. Okay, it's even become the word of the year. Best selfie ever. My graduation picture. Selfies are there. And what you choose to photograph and how you choose to distribute it is very important. That is not Dan's cat, by the way. But it's there. And you can use it for satire, and you can use it for information, but you can also use it in a meaningful way. The digital realm, therefore, has this ability to find great beauty, but also to distort the truth. One artist has gone through the web and simply searched out all the sunsets and put them together in a collage. And that's exquisite. On the other hand, we're always haunted by our tourist from 9/11, who will always be with us in some degree too. The point is, the photograph can still have a great deal of personal impact for anybody who creates it. It can grow up through the artwork of the century. It can go up through the different social fields and impacts that it has. It can have cultural resonance. It can have personal resonance. It's got to have that meaning to everyone. And what it does, this, by the way, is the old way we used to. You now carry pictures around on your cell phone, but once upon a time, you had window sleeves and wallets to do that. The old man who is the subject of this photograph, his name is Cherry. Cherry once said, "This is my art gallery," and showed the wallet. So you have all those tools available for you. How you choose to use them and what you choose to do with them is critically important, because that, I think, is sort of the message I would give you at the end of this course. For me, is the fact that you are entering an era when it's much more responsible for what you do and how you deal with images, because they're only going to get more prolific, more profound, more every day around you in every sort of fashion. I dare say I think every one of you probably has a cell phone in your pocket now and can make an image at any time. That's a staggering thought when you think about it, as well as the fact that that same tool can now distribute it to anybody else you want to too. So here's your rules for survival. Remember, number one, it's the objective versus the subjective. No photograph is completely one or completely the other. Both are at play in the creation of any image. It's up to you to determine that. Number two, keep looking and seeing, especially the seeing part. To look at something and go on is one thing. To see implies that you've also brought your mind to bear on it and tried to think something about it. Third is question the context. Where did you see it? How's it being used? What words went with it? Who made those and why? Because the image is going to be shaped by what's framed around it at all times. And the fourth one is trust your gut. Quite honestly, you're going to gain experience from the way you've looked at photographs and the way you've seen them through your life. Appreciate that, pay attention to it at all times, and know it's there, because all that is very impossible. My favorite quotation: "Man is still a fountain of truth even today." Other than that, I think that's the best warning I can give you and the best summation for what's here, except that behind every one of these images is an idea, is a thought, is a shape, notion. Dan's giving you the relevance to the ideas and the philosophy that's come along at this time. It's up to you to put them together as you go. Happy Thanksgiving.